All right. Good morning, everybody. Good to see everybody. Isaiah 53 today. So we're on part 4. Maybe this has been the fifth in this series. Maybe one more. We'll see. Trusting God in the darkness. And this we're entitling "Crushed Yet Vindicated." This is from Isaiah 53. But looking at the servant songs, this takes us back to Isaiah chapter 42, then 49, then into Isaiah 50, and now Isaiah, midway into Isaiah 52, and then into Isaiah 53. We started with Isaiah 50 in verse 10, "Who is among you that fears the Lord, that obeys the voice of his servant, that walks in darkness, has no light?" And this is where we get the title, "Trusting God in Darkness." Who walks in darkness has no light. Let him trust in the name of the Lord and rely on his God. So we've been tracing a journey through these servant songs. In part 1, we heard Isaiah 50 and verse 10. "Who among you fears the Lord, obeys the voice of his servant." And the right response then is to trust and to rely. We also see that in Proverbs 3 and verse 5, we said many times. And in part 2, we met the servant in, as I said a moment ago, Isaiah 42 and 49. God's Spirit anointed, gentle servant in whom the Father delights. And then we heard, if you remember, that expressed discouragement. "I have labored in vain." And we saw God expand his mission. Is it too small a thing? That is it too small a thing that you should restore Israel alone? He will be a light to all the nations, or to the nations. And then in part 3, we listened to Isaiah 50, verses 4 through 11, that extended section. We saw the servant's inner life. And then listening, that is listening before speaking, if you remember that. Listening before speaking wants to be a help to the weary, but first he has to give his ear to the Lord first. Remember that mourning by mourning, which I thought was quite instructive, but to obey in suffering, setting his face like a flint. Remember that carries over to Jesus in Luke 9:51. And then we heard the call to follow that pattern. And then what we find, then we went back to Isaiah 50 and verse 11. "Don't light your own fires." So today then we come to this mountain peak, we should say, in this arc, ARC, this arc, in these servant songs, Isaiah 52, about verse 13, then on through chapter 53 and verse 12, where Isaiah shows us the deepest darkness of the servant, that the servant will ever enter. And not just the darkness of suffering with us, that is to say, as somebody who would empathize or sympathize or something like that, but the darkness of suffering for us. He's not only our example in suffering, but he is our substitute. I'm going to keep that in mind always, our substitute in judgment. So 2 questions guide us, and one is, what is happening at the cross, to make that immediate parallel, but what's happening at the cross according to Isaiah chapter 53, and then how does that shape the way we respond to darkness, both circumstantial and moral? Remember some time ago we talked about that idea of darkness, that it's not always moral darkness as John depicts it in 1 John chapter 1, verses 5 through 10, but it can be circumstantial. But in this case, what if it's moral, but it isn't on the part of Christ, for example, but circumstantial and moral. How do we respond to that? But if we look at the text itself and just listen to that, you follow along there, whatever version of the text you might have. This would be New American Standard, but it says, "Behold, my servant will prosper. He'll be light and lifted up and greatly exalted, just as many as were astonished at you, my people." So his appearance was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. Thus He'll sprinkle many nations. Kings will shut their mouths on account of him. For what had not been told them, they will see, and what they had not heard, they will understand. And then this with regard to the suffering servant who hath believed our message, and to whom the arm of the Lord been revealed. For he grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of parched ground. He has no stately form or majesty that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and like one from whom men hide their face, he was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastising for our, just keep focusing on our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. All of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us have turned to his own way, but the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due. His grave was assigned with wicked men, yet he was with a rich man in his death, because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. But the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief, if he would render himself as a guilt offering. He will see his offering, he will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many, as he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide the booty with the strong. This is an incredible little piece right here, because there's many in this section, but this idea of dividing the spoil, and you have to just consider for a moment, by what means is he victorious? This idea of, he's victorious by his blood. This carries over in the book of Revelation, by the way. It's an incredible little piece right there that we can't amplify too much today, but it could be amplified in a great way. He'll divide the booty with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he himself bore the sin of many and interceded for the transgressors. So first section we could consider here is the servant crushed by the will of the Lord. I mean, this is just sort of scandalizes reason a little bit, but if we take this apart a little bit piece by piece, Isaiah's song begins and ends with the servant's exaltation, but the path runs through crushing. And we know how this thing ends. We know the trajectory of it. But when we think that the path runs straight through crushing. And so for us that, know the New Testament kind of equivalent of this, I think it's just interesting. If you just put this kind of in the margins, I don't have it in the notes. I just have it scribbled here on top of the note, which is what I invariably do. But just put Philippians 2:5-11 in there, because I know we know this passage. It's just hard not to think of that passage when we're looking at this one. But I think this is undoubtedly what's shaping Paul's thinking. Obviously, this is what's shaping Paul's thinking. It's like the green screen that's in the back of Paul's mind and understanding. But no doubt also, I don't think it's just influencing Paul's interpretive grid of which he's using to formulate his teaching, because that's just to sort of think theologically. I think really this is shaping Paul's personal commitment to Christ, and that just comes out in his teaching. I think this is more so how he frames his understanding, for example, in Galatians 2:20 and things like this. Is just how he understands the Christian life, the pattern of his own life, and let's put it in the shape of surrender. This is just how Paul understands, if he's going to be like Christ, he's thinking back to this servant, and he's thinking about this path that we've been following in these servant songs. When he says, for example, in the same book, you go from Philippians 2, where it basically takes him through even death on a cross, and he'll be given the name which is above every name. You see the vindication there. You see the just sweeping through the valley of being crushed, and then on through to the pinnacle of this. You see the same trajectory there in Philippians. I just think that's interesting, and it's not accidental at all. It's not accidental. But then take the same thing, and this we allude to a little bit further on today, but in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 21 through 25, right? And you get the same. For you've been called to this purpose, and Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. And he's talking about that he, as a lamb before the shears opened not his mouth and things like this. So I said, look, for Peter as well, that's the green screen behind him, as he just formulates a response for those sojourners who are facing, how are they to behave? How are they to behave within the context of perhaps, well, he does identify some various contexts as far as a mixed marriage. How are wives supposed to, if they're married, to find themselves with a husband who's not, how's that going to work? What about a slave that is in a household with a master that doesn't, there's all these inequities he's posing, right? And what if you find yourself with a government that doesn't, that afflicts you and things like that? What to do, in the context of that type of suffering points him back every time. There's one overarching example. It's not a different response in every situation, but there's one overarching example, and that's this suffering servant. And that's what Peter had this in his mind. In this case, Paul had this in his mind. And I think first and foremost, it's not just a teaching example theoretically, right? It's not just a teaching example or hypothetically, theoretically, but it's one that was embedded in their personal experience, and one that they used as a roadmap for their own life. That is for Peter and for Paul. So we hasten on then. I just think first that this exaltation is announced through shocking suffering. We see this in Isaiah 52, 13 through 15 as we read this, right? Behold, my servant will prosper. He'll be high and lifted up and greatly exalted. And this idea, this language that Isaiah is using is shocking to us, because when we hear about this notion of being high and lifted up and things like this, but then this is set against his describing his appearance was so marred beyond his visage, beyond human appearance. He'll be disfigured. And we think then that here's this crown set off in the distance, but before the crown is going to come this crushing. And somehow, I know we have to get through this, keep moving, but at the same time, it's hard not to just take a step back and take a breath and say, wait a minute, but what about our lives? What about the context of our experience? And to think, wait a minute. So God's going to work this thing out. God's going to take care of me. God's going to make the provisions. God's going to fix. God's going to do whatever God does. But how tolerant am I of the crushing? How do I somehow fit that into my understanding of how God works? Or am I so focused on the finality and the victory and the blessing and the relief factor? Wait a minute, that's a product. But the relief, the relief that I forget about this part of it. So God's way of lifting up the servant will pass through suffering that shocks and repels. So I scribble something else in here, and that takes me to, and see if it doesn't take you there, but like Revelation chapter 5 and verse 6. So go don't turn there, but just in your mind, let your mind shift there. And there you have this, the Lamb, the risen Lamb, and he's pictured before the throne, and he's going to take from the right hand the seven-sealed scroll, and there's all this imagery going on there. But what I'm saying is he's pictured as what? He's pictured as one who is, so he's standing. So John is weeping and all this. Who's going to? He said, "What? Hey, stop weeping, because here he is. Here he is, the one who is conquered, the one who is vanquished." But then, how did he conquer? He conquered through death, and without just running a field and going this way. But this is how the Lamb conquered through death, and so on. But the idea of this Sapso, this idea of the verb, he's standing as one who is slain but slaughtered. I mean, the verb is one who is butchered, or one who has had its throat cut, or one who is. It pictures the most violent verb you could come up with to picture taking this animal and sacrificing and offering, and said that's what he endured. The most brutal of treatment to get there to victory. So things that shock and things that repel. So now you have, the movement continues to shift further into this being rejected and misunderstood. If that resonates with anyone, rejected, who has believed what they heard from us, in other words, and to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed, and he has no stately form or majesty, we should look on him, and so on, and all this type of description. When the servant comes, he will not match any of the preconceived notions or earthly expectations of anybody that's looking for some king or some royalty or something like that. And we know this. He was born in a manger. He was raised in Nazareth. And what kind of king is going to come from there? Didn't Nathaniel say, remember this from John chapter 1, right? What good is going to come from Nazareth? This kind of thing. So no political office, no army, no palace, none of this, but ultimately crucified, executed as a criminal, mocked as the king of the Jews, if you recall this. And this is recorded, this kind of mocking is recorded in all four Gospels. We see this, so it's fairly prolific. So in Isaiah's day, kings were expected to be physically impressive, militarily successful, politically dominant, outwardly majestic. And this would go back as far as you could trace, the cultural side of this back as far as King Saul. First Samuel 10, 23 and 24, you see in there, here's somebody who was, look at him. He's head and shoulders above the rest. He's physically, looks like somebody who's physically dominant, everything. That's what you chose a king for. He's someone who could stand off in battle and defeat everybody else and something like that. His physical stature, military success, certainly he could do that. And you think of someone like David, David, who could take his band of men and defeat anybody against the odds. And you look at him in contrast to somebody like Ahaz, as far as those types of kings. And Ahaz, you can look even within the biblical biblical record, and it'll say just very definitively, like in 2 Chronicles 28:1, it will just the chronicler will do it for you. He will contrast it for you. It says, here's one who was unlike his father David. In other words, Father David strong, the son weak. Why? Because he did not walk in the ways of the Lord. And then it goes on to say why he didn't walk in the ways of the Lord. It's because, and then you'd look at 2 Kings and other places where the history will be delineated. He would reject, specifically not walk in the ways of the Lord, because when Isaiah came to him and said, hey, the Lord, I'll give you a sign, and the Lord wants to, no, not going to do it. Instead, when the Syrian army and the northern, the king of the north, that is Israel proper, and he's the king of Judah, is going to come against them. Rather than seek the Lord, what's he going to do? He's going to go to Assyria and say, hey, come on, why don't you guys help me out, and things of that nature. So this is how things were done back in the day. And we have all these kind of things are part of the backdrop to all of this. And so what we find that Isaiah 53, this passage in the servant song is giving us, is that it's deliberately contradicting these expectations, and is basically giving us somebody who appears to be just weak and defeated and all of this. Israel expected a Davidic conqueror. Isaiah presents a suffering servant. So with Jesus, we see the same disconnect, born in a manger. So you imagine, fast forward 7 centuries, and what are the Jews looking for? The same thing. This is what we want to see in our Messiah, head and shoulders above the rest. We want to see this conquering ruler. We want to see all these things. And what do they get? Born in a manger, not a palace, surrounded by fishermen, not generals, riding on a donkey, not a war horse, dying on a Roman cross, not seated on a throne. So by historical standards, his mission looked like a failure at every stage until the empty tomb, until the resurrection. So Isaiah 53 introduces a profound theme. God's salvation is veiled in weakness. So many times, the spiritual truths, and to get us to understand spiritual realities, we have to invert our intuition. I don't know where that last phrase came from, but I think it makes sense. Many times we have to invert our intuition, which is, say, our gut reaction to the most basic things in life. But spiritual realities don't cooperate very well with our gut intuitions. So Isaiah 53 introduces this profound theme, right? So just look at this. God's salvation veiled in weakness before it's revealed in power. How about 2 Corinthians 13:4, which I don't mention in the notes either, but he was crucified in weakness, but he lives by the power of God, right? I mean, this is just so on the money with Isaiah 53. Crucified in weakness, but lives by the power of God. And then, as a matter of fact, I got to get there. My grandfather used to say, hasten Jason. I think he meant that for me. But 2 Corinthians 13:4, all the way to the end, because I want to read the rest of the verse. He was crucified in weakness, yet he lives by the power of God. For we also are weak in him, yet we'll live by him because of the power of God directed toward you, right? So we follow that same pattern. But listen, weakness is the idea of his voluntary submission to suffering and his living, let's say suffering and death, right? So he voluntarily submits to suffering and death. That's his weakness. But his living by the power of God is his resurrection and his vindication, that is of his identity and mission. So God's power is not the opposite of weakness. It is revealed through it. And this, again, is a scandal to reason, and it inverts our intuition. This is why Paul would say, when I am weak, then I am... When I am weak, I'm not praying for strength, But when I am weak, I am strong, right? And that is a profound statement. He doesn't say, when I am weak, then I'm weak. And I tell God, I'm weak, give me strength. It's just a profound statement that he makes, doesn't he? So Isaiah 53 teaches that God works through humility, not grandeur, through pain, not applause, through obedience, not force, through sacrifice, not spectacle. And this is the theological key that unlocks the life of Jesus. And again, back in 1 Peter 2, 21 to 25, to bring that parallel into the New Testament, we see Jesus as a fulfillment and antitype, meaning you have a type or a shadow cast in the Old Testament, a picture, but then we have the reality in the New Testament of Isaiah's suffering, who innocently endured injustice to redeem others, thereby showing believers how to endure hardships such as, and as I mentioned a moment ago, there were several of these little scenes depicted. Peter mentions a mixed marriage, and these were going to be fairly common. And why? Not because two people were entering into a marriage knowingly mixed, but because you're evangelizing a mass group of people. Imagine you're evangelizing a mass group of Christianity comes into this community, and imagine a group of women who say, "Yes, I'll follow Christ," and the husband doesn't. What happens? Instant mixed marriage. So, and this creates a situation. It creates a situation. You have a household servant, which is the term that Peter uses for that particular variety of slave, and what happens to him when he gets put in a situation with, and it wasn't always the case, and many times it was a good situation, even though by rights you had no rights, and you were owned, and all these types of things. So in one sense, not a good situation, but the other thing, many times the masters treated them well, and it worked out okay. But what happens if the master didn't treat them? What happens if it was a brutal situation? And so if it was hostile towards this person's faith or something like that. So Peter's picturing all of these situations. What happens? And he holds this suffering servant as the embodiment of what to do, not in theory, but saying you have someone who actually walked through this painful and paid with his life. You have someone who actually knows what you're going through, who actually felt your pain, who actually knows. And the whole trajectory of it too, which we don't want to lose sight of this. It's not just about somebody who knows, who can empathize, who can sympathize, who knows what it's like to suffer just for the sake of suffering. But we want to keep in mind the trajectory of this is towards vindication. Whatever that looks like, however God is going to use this. But the point being that model, even though we're not amplifying it and spending a lot of time there in 1 Peter 2, but that model is intended to display the life of Christ through us in a context of injustice and unfairness and all those kinds of things, and for us to respond in the one way intended by God so that God can fulfill his purpose through us. So Jesus embodies the servant as the sinless one who bore our sins in his body on the tree without retaliation, entrusting himself to God's judgment, calling us to follow in his steps amid unjust suffering. And this, by the way, being no small thing. Why? Because it was so countercultural that it transformed Greco-Roman society. Only that. Only that. I mean, can you imagine? Well, the servant's vindication, speaking of this is Isaiah 53, 11 and 12. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. His knowledge of the righteous one. And the satisfaction is not because of the suffering. The satisfaction is because of what the suffering will accomplish, right? But it's the idea of the progression. You look at the progression. This is where we're seeing the vindication, where you have apparent failure to rejection, to suffering, to death, to vindication and triumph. You're seeing this from 10 to 12. And every step downward becomes a basis for upward exaltation. And again, you could just parallel this with Philippians chapter 2. It's just line them up, two categories, and preach them both at the same time if you want. But this is the same pattern the New Testament uses. Cross, resurrection, ascension, reign, if you will, if you want to just carry it on straight through. Humiliation before exaltation. But if he's our example, then it could be said, we could just apply that, superimpose as a template in our own life. You know, humiliation before exaltation. So the earliest believers used Isaiah 53 as their interpretive lens. What do we mean by that? You know, it's like, how do I understand life? How I understand my living out the Christian life in this world. So you know, you have Philip, right? Philip, the evangelist who explains Jesus to the Ethiopian eunuch, who's questioning, you know, Isaiah 53. In Acts chapter 8, you have Peter, as we just mentioned a moment ago, references it explicitly, and that to those sojourners. And then Paul uses the same kind of foolishness motif. If you remember in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where he opens 1 Corinthians 1, 18 through 25, you get this same sense of Christians being maligned as just foolish, weak, nothing. You know, there's nothing, and then there's, you know, how Paul describes it. So the New Testament authors didn't merely apply Isaiah 53 to Jesus. They believe that Isaiah 53 explained why the Messiah had to appear like a failure before he was. It isn't just that happened historically, so let's just describe what happened historically, but it's an explanation. There was a certain structure that was part of God's plan. This is what is shocking, you know, to many. In fact, if you go back and try to theologically map it, it becomes a shocking thing. God willed that. You know, God, and this is what we'll see in a moment, but so the mockery around Jesus' death displays Isaiah 53's theme in real time. For example, Matthew 27, if you're the Son of God, come down. You see this mocking. Imagine being taunted like, if you're the Son of God, come down. And you're writhing there on the cross, you know. He could have called, right? So he saved others, but he cannot save him. He cannot save himself. We hoped, remember Luke 20:40, he comes in, he sidles in along the two on the road to Emmaus. Remember this? Well, we hoped he was the one that was going to redeem Israel. we hoped that, you're like, okay. So every insult is an ironic fulfillment of Isaiah's portrait. In other words, the greatest act of salvation appeared to be the greatest failure. So Revelation 5, then, as we mentioned a moment ago, unveils the Lamb as if slain, the ultimate vindication of the mocked servant of Isaiah 53. So he transforms the cross's apparent failure into ultimate triumph, where the scars, stigmata in Greek there, the scars of insult become badges of worthiness. Every taunt and wound ironically qualifies the Lamb to open the scroll, redeeming creation through the very humiliation that seemed to disprove his kingship. And John weeps, this term for, we could go into that in more detail, but the weeping is weeping incessantly, uncontrollably, just convulsing over the sheer hopelessness of this, which just seems to be contrary to everything John would know, but he's just overcome because of the scene. And here's the sealed scroll until the Lamb of Judah appears. But he sees a lamb standing as though it had been slain, as though it had been slaughtered, as the term was, 7 horns and 7 eyes, the ultimate authority, this is language from Zechariah chapter 4, by the way. And so the slaughter marks echo Isaiah 53's wounded. See, so the parallels are explicit there. But passion mockeries, save yourself, echo Isaiah 53's rejection. Then you have heavenly worship of the elders, of the angels, and the creatures there. So the greatest failure that is a slain lamb unlocks history's scroll, achieving what no other could: atonement, judgment, new creation. This inverts earthly scorn into eternal acclaim. So the cross is the ultimate demonstration that God fulfills his purposes in ways that confound human wisdom. So we ought to just, even though we're going really fast, we ought to just sit on that one for a moment, because when we think, wait a minute, in my situation, in my real life situation, when I have something that's just really chaotic, really painful, really brutal, and to think, is there anything more chaotic, more brutal, more unfair, more unjust than the cross? And to think that fulfilled the purpose of God, but in a way that absolutely confounded human wisdom. So can't God do the same in my life? And I think that many times we're just not going to have an explanation. We want an explanation. Our minds want to connect all the dots to every painful thing. And many times the dissonance that goes on in our brain, because we can't, we need information to make that go away. And many times it doesn't, unless we just accept that there is an explanation, but it resides in the mind of God. And unless I trust just says, I leave it in the mind of God. And ultimately that cross is purely what we have. So the camera then moves from how he appears to what he accomplishes. And this is what Isaiah does, right? So if there's a panoramic view, even though we have literal text here, to a visual image, this is what he looks like, this is how he appears, but now we're going to move to what he accomplishes. Verses 4 through 9. Surely our griefs he himself bore. This is all the things that he did. Our sorrows he carried, and so on and so on and so on. This is how we esteemed him, and so on. It tells us what our part was. We thought he was suffering. We did. We thought he's suffering for his own sins, until we discover that he's suffering for ours. He's pierced for our transgressions. He's crushed for our iniquities. All we like sheep have gone astray. The Lord's laid on him the iniquity of us all. That's the cross. And then Isaiah shows us his posture. He's oppressed, he's afflicted. He opens out his mouth like a lamb led to the slaughter. Like a sheep before its shears is silent, so he opened out his mouth. Again, Peter uses this terminology. This is exactly what we see in the gospel. Jesus stands before the Sanhedrin, before Pilate, before Herod, before the mob. Where's his defense? Could have, but no. He's done nothing wrong, but he stands silent like the servant. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. He was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked, with a rich man in his death. So he dies Under the miscarriage of justice, he's executed with criminals, yet buried in a rich man's tomb, just as Isaiah said. So all of this is not random. There's another thing that we should have to park away in our brain, because there's another thing that absolutely disturbs us, rationally. We want to see things in order. When things are not in order, very disturbing, right? So many times we can accept painful things, unjust things. Sometimes we can pack them away, pigeonhole them if we can see the order in it. Disorder and chaos, that just is like dumping gasoline on it. But to understand that none of this is random. As obscene as the picture is, none of it is random. But then when we come to this theological summit, if you will, we come to this theological summit then, that it was the will of the Lord to crush him. And we think from one angle, Jesus is betrayed by Judas. He's condemned by the Sanhedrin. He's handed over to Pilate. From another angle, lawless men crucify and kill him. But at the deepest level, Isaiah says, well, it was the will of the Lord to crush him. So God is not some passive observer at the cross. He's not wringing his hands, watching events spiral out of control. The crucifixion of the servant is a deliberate, sovereign purpose of God. It doesn't mean the Father was cruel or indifferent. It means he's so committed to justice and mercy that he purposes to deal with sin once and for all through the atoning death of his servant. And we see this just so well articulated, let's say, by John the apostle in his gospel. So you think of the servant songs together as they progress, as we looked at them. Isaiah 42, the servant is spirit anointed to bring justice, and he does so gently without breaking bruised reeds. But if all we had was that, we don't yet know how justice and mercy will meet. So we say, by what means? By what means are you going to do this? And then we come to Isaiah 49, and the servant feels he's labored in vain. And yet God says, well, his mission will reach the ends of the earth. So we say, well, by what means will you do this? And then the question, well, then what will be the extent of this? Well, whatever you're going to do, it's not just going to be for one limited group of people. It's going to go to the ends of the earth. We said, this is interesting. Then we come to Isaiah 50. The servant obeys in suffering and gives his back to those who strike. He sets his face like flint, trusting God. And we see now we have just resolve and intent to get this done, leaving us right at the summit to what's this going to be. None of this is an accident. It's just the heart of the gospel. And that has massive implications for the darkness we walk through. If that darkest hour in the universe, that darkest hour, was under the will of God, then no darkness we can encounter is random, not with a sovereign God. Now, our darkness is not going to be atoning. There's only one person whose darkness was atoning, and that was his. But it doesn't mean that it's meaningless. It's meaningful. Even though it might be chaotic, maybe we can't understand it, maybe we don't have the full explanation on all these kinds of things. So the servant is vindicated. This is verses 10 through 12. The servant is vindicated and rewarded. And we see that if we stopped at it was the will of the Lord to crush him, we would only have tragedy. But Isaiah doesn't stop there, nor does God stop there with us. So there's life beyond death, yet it was the will of God to crush him, and he put him to grief, and when his soul makes an offering, he will see his offspring, and he goes on with that. He dies as a guilt offering, yet Isaiah says he will see his offspring and prolong his days. Well, how can that be? How can that be? And this can only be accomplished through resurrection. The servant's death is not only the end of his, is not the end of his story. He'll live again to see the spiritual offspring his death has purchased. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand, not despite his suffering, but because of it. And he'll justify many. He is the righteous one. He bears the iniquity. He makes many to be accounted righteous. I just wanted to point out, too, that this idea of reward and intercession here, he says, therefore I will allot to him a portion with the great. He'll divide the booty with the strong. And I thought this is just these spoils of war, in the Near East, that these kings, when they went off and fought in battle, then there would be the spoils that would, the plunder, that the king would get. The plunder would belong to him. And yet, where's the weapon here? Where's the weapon of his victory? And you're seeing this as his blood being the weapon of his victory. And this is how counterintuitive all of this is, and how many times we miss this and we don't see in our own lives in the darkest hours and in the deepest set of painful circumstances, when the blood is being shed, if you will, to borrow that terminology, when things are so gratuitous that we can't understand and we cry out to God, that this is a weapon. We are actually winning a battle. Though the tears are coming down our face, though everything seems to be falling apart, that we are actually winning a battle. We just place ourselves in God's hands and allow God to continue to wage that war and fight that battle. But this is what is happening here. He pours out his soul to death, bore the sin of many, and look at what God is accomplishing through him. And the same is true for us. And there's more here, but I think for today I'll leave it here, because I think this is a valid point. Not to lose sight of what God is doing based on this example. And I'll just close with one, because in case you need a biblical hook, I would give you Hebrews 12 and verse 3, because we know Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. Therefore, being surrounded by such a great cloud, there's a crowd in the cloud. There's grace for the race. There's fun in the run, but you got to look to the book, right? That's Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. But then you come to Hebrews 12 and verse 3, and what does it say? Because that 1 and 2 is tough, right? But looking unto Jesus is, you got to deliberate looking away from and keeping your eyes on him. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Wow. Does that not, any one of us could preach an hour on the parallel between that and the suffering servant, right? Because there's such a parallel there. Because if you come from Isaiah chapter 11 and all of those examples, and you go back and take that to any one of those, say, hey, could I, Abraham, come on over here. Moses, come in, and talk to any of them and say, in your darkest hour, at the height of your pain, when you were going through that, what was happening? What was your mindset? What were you thinking about God then? And then, but here now, knowing what they didn't, and that we have a Redeemer who walked that path before us and went to that. It's not about just that cross and that, caricature of that in our brain, but knowing the suffering and why and for us, and saying, just consider him. And that word consider, you have to circle 100 times and highlight it, because it means to really give careful thought and really study it and really pay attention to it. There's something to be seen and to be learned and to be applied and not to be forgotten, because he took it all. Whatever you're going through pales. It's not that it's not important. It's not that he's saying, hey, oh, that's nothing compared to what I went through at the cross. That's not what he's saying. But he's saying, I know what you're going through. I know every bit of it. And he'd wrap both arms around you and squeeze hard. He said, I know what you're going through. I know what you're facing, so don't grow weary. I was at a annual meeting for one of our accreditors down in Orlando, a week or so ago, and the president of Liberty University was here. He was doing one of the plenary sessions study, and he's an ex-admiral, right, with the Navy, but he was given an example from one of the training of the Navy SEALs, and how they can, if in the middle of the training, it gets so bad that they just can't, they got to get out, they ring the bell, right? They ring the bell, they put his closing statement to everybody was, don't ring the bell. Don't ring. I thought that was just so, that just etched in my brain. Don't ring the bell. Don't ring, because he was showing a video, of the actual training, and these guys taking the helmet, because they have to take the helmet off, sit it down, ring the bell, and they're sitting there out, and you're out. He says, don't, whatever happens. And I mean, this is severe stuff there. I mean, this is life-threatening stuff. I mean, this is severe stuff. And it can get bad. It can get bad. But where in the Word does it say, this is first person from God, I will give up on you. I will let you down. There's precedent in there for times when God failed people. I will put stuff on you that you can't handle. Nothing. You won't find any of that anywhere. So we have no justification to do this, right? And no matter what, just face forward like a flint. 951, tattoo that on your forehead and check it out in the mirror every day. Well, it'd be inverted probably, but maybe not. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for your word. Thank you for a very present example of your Son. It's more than an example, one that we can embody because His Spirit is part of us, is our life, our new birth. And we just consecrate ourselves anew and afresh and resign ourselves to allow your life to just flow through us. And that just can't be when everything's going the way we want it to go, but it just has to just be. And let it be part of our breath each day, and pray that we just hold each other up in prayer. And thank you for this group. Thank you for how we encourage each other, pray for each other. And Lord, we just ask that you'd continue to bless us in this day and the coming days as we seek to put you first, ever and always in our lives. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.